Hello and welcome to another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. We're going to look through essentially a general arc of survey data or survey-based attitude data from multiple countries within osteopathy and talking about or asking about evidence-based practice, and then try to abstract what the point would be as an osteopathic practitioner when considering evidence-based practice, as well as whether or not it's likely that there's meaningful evidence within the profession or within the constraints of the profession of osteopathy to really make choices on or to really attempt to build interventions on. So I'm going to share my screen. So for those who are simply listening, I will do my best to describe what's going on. And for those who are able to watch, you'll see what's going on, right? I'm going to do a little bit here to try to, oh, no, not that, come on. Please excuse me as I work with this technology and it doesn't do what I want. Come on. It's not doing what I want. Please excuse me for a moment as I fumble, rumble, and stumble. There we go. Okay, that should be better. So we're going to initially, there was a paper that I was reading and I came across, or really an abstract that I was reading, and I came across that there was a group of authors that had done a large or several studies in multiple countries, and the title is essentially Investigation of Whatever Country, Osteopaths' Attitudes, Skills, and Utilization of Evidence-Based Practice, a National Cross-Sectional Survey. So I get to that, and then I go and look through all of these. Now, again, the author list is quite similar, so you know that this is a group of authors. The lead author changes mildly, and I think the lead author is primarily going to change based on language within country being surveyed, as far as I can tell, and I may be wrong about that. So the first one that came up in the reference list, a national cross-sectional survey of the attitude, skills, and use of evidence-based practice among Spanish osteopaths. And this is from 2021. So we'll briefly run through the abstract. So this is me reading. Although evidence-based practice, EBP, is largely supported across healthcare professions, its implementation in manual therapy professions such as osteopathy remains limited and debated. There's currently little knowledge of how Spanish osteopaths relate to EBP. Objectives. The main aim of this study was to investigate the attitude, skills, and use of EBP among Spanish osteopaths. The secondary aim was to identify barriers and facilitators for the adoption of EBP in the Spanish osteopathic context. Methods. National cross-sectional survey of Spanish osteopaths registered and non-registered to an osteopathic association in Spain. Eligible participants were invited by a range of recruitment strategies, including email and social media campaigns, to complete the Spanish Translated Evidence-Based Practice and Attitude Utilization Survey, EBASE, anonymously online. Results. A total of 567 osteopaths completed the survey, which represents an approximate response rate of 9%. I will pull out from reading for a moment. Generally, surveys have very low response rates, so this is not strange, but it's pretty normal. So the challenge with a lot of surveys based on low response rates, which is completely normal, is that you have likely a similar characteristic in that the people who do respond are the people who will respond, such that they share at least one characteristic in common with each other, which then points to the high likelihood that there may be some other characteristics that they also share, such that whatever data is collected is going to carry that challenge, that the people who do respond are very similar to one another, such that the rest of the people who do not respond may actually be different, and thus the survey data may not be representative of the general population that you're attempting to interface with or understand. So there's always a challenge with it, but you have to accept that. It's one of the reasons why you will do your best to note response rates. So to go back to reading, participants' attitudes towards EBP were largely positive. Most respondents agreed or strongly agreed that EBP was necessary in the practice of osteopathy, 89.6%, and that professional literature and research findings were useful to their day-to-day practice, 88.9%. Levels of perceived skill in EBP were reported as low to moderate, with lowest levels for items related to research conduct. Except reading reviewing professional literature and using online search engines to find practice-related literature, participant engagement in all other EBP-related activities was generally infrequent. The perceived proportion of clinical practice was based on clinical research evidence was reported to be very small. Main barriers to EBP uptake included a lack of clinical evidence in osteopathy and insufficient skills for applying research finding. Main facilitators of EBP uptake included access to full-text articles, internet at the workplace, and online databases. Okay, so to really quickly go back into what I just read, perceived proportion of clinical practice that was based on clinical research evidence was reported to be very small. So people have a positive attitude. They say it's really awesome. So 89.6 say it's necessary, and 88.9% say research findings were useful to their day-to-day practice. So they have a positive report, but then the perceived proportion of the clinical practice that was based on clinical research evidence was reported to be very small. This is what you would call a gap, or what you could call a gap. So for somebody who likes the concept of evidence-based practice, this would be a gap. So there's the stated preference. They think it's important. There's the revealed preference. They say they don't do it much or they don't use it much. So that's a gap that somebody would attempt to get funding and support to close. Okay, so you can see that there is an opportunity based on what is found here to attempt to do something to close this gap. There's a noted gap. The main barriers to EBP uptake included a lack of clinical evidence in osteopathy and insufficient skills for applying research findings. Okay, so the important piece here is there is a noted lack of clinical evidence in osteopathy, right? So the insufficient skills, that's self-report. Maybe they do have sufficient skills, maybe they don't, but sometimes the way that these things are noted can make it hard for somebody to answer in a way that would properly reflect what they do. They may actually have the skills, but the way the question is worded, maybe they don't, or maybe they think they don't. The conclusions, to read the conclusions, Spanish osteopaths were largely supportive of evidence-based practice, had low to moderate skills in EBP, and engaged in EBP activities infrequently. Formal regulation of the profession in Spain and the inclusion of osteopathic programs into the university sector would potentially improve EBP skills and use. So that is where you see a conclusion that would support an attempt to fill the gap. This is a point in research, whether or not somebody is ideologically motivated. The type of conclusion that you will propose would be one that is supported by the gap that you identify, and you can attempt to fill that gap, right? So whether that's appropriate or not is not the point of what I'm trying to show here, but this survey identifies a gap. One of the biggest things that exists in the gap is low amounts of evidence-based research in osteopathy. So what I would say is, if you're not looking at the foundation of the problem, that anything that you do to attempt to ameliorate it or improve it, if the bedrock isn't solid, then you're building that flaw into everything. So to teach people how to use evidence-based practice where the evidence base isn't there may not be as useful as you want it to be. They may be very good at evaluating research, and then they may just be very sour about the profession, right? I happen to be a person who you could claim as sour about the research in the profession. That doesn't mean that I am negative about the fact that it is occurring. I just think that maybe the manner in which it's often conducted could be better, right? So we switch to another one. This is from the same group. So let's just look back here real quick just to talk about the lead author. So the lead author for the Spanish one was Gerard Alvarez. The lead author for the Swedish one is Matthew J. Leach. And then Alvarez is not there, but you see some similar authors. Hold on, let's see. Oliver P. Thompson and Matthew Leach in the Spanish one. Leach and Thompson are here in the Swedish one. And we're going to read the abstract just so you start to see similarities. Background: evidence-based practice is integral to the provision of ethical, safe, and high-quality healthcare. While osteopathy is an established and registered health profession in many countries, it is a developing, unregistered health profession in Sweden. The study explored the perception, skills, use, barriers, and enablers of EBP among Swedish osteopaths. Members of the Swedish Osteopathic Association were invited by email to participate in an anonymous online survey, a Swedish translated and pilot-tested version of the evidence-based practice attitude and utilization survey. Data collection was conducted between January and March of 2019. So you see, just to pull out of reading, the same survey was used in Swedish and in Spanish, and it was translated. Okay, go back to reading. Results: 31% of invited osteopaths responded to the survey. Respondents were largely supportive of EBP, and most agreed or strongly agreed that EBP-assisted clinical decision-making improved quality of patient care. So you get I'll just keep reading and not note the percentages, please excuse me. To go back to reading, and was necessary in the practice of osteopathy. Respondents typically reported moderate to moderate high levels of EBP skills, whereas their level of engagement in EBP activities was very variable and infrequent. The main reported barrier for EBP uptake was a lack of clinical evidence in osteopathy. Workplace access to the internet and free online databases and the ability to download full-text journal articles were considered very useful enablers of EBP. So again, same methods, similar author group, and similar findings. Positive attitude towards it, but then when you actually look at what they do, they show low levels of engagement in it. And one of the main barriers is low levels of evidence base, right? Or lack of clinical evidence in osteopathy is how it's termed. So I'm going to read the conclusion from the abstract. The responding Swedish osteopaths appear largely supportive of EBP, report moderate to moderate high levels of EBP skills, but participated infrequently in EBP activities. Studies of interventions aimed at enhancing these skills and clinical use of EBP in osteopathy are warranted. So this one came out in 2019 before the one in Spain. The conclusion in Spain was, let's put this in universities. The conclusion from the gap in Sweden is more studies. Okay, so more studies is a way that people can gain more evidence, but also a way to continue work. So if you can note that you want more studies, you quite possibly can get more funding. So there you go. Let's look at this one, the next one, and this is 2019 as well. So Leach, Fryer was in the last one, Thompson. So similar author group. This is Investigation of Australian Osteopaths' Attitude, Skills, and Utilization of Evidence-Based Practice, National Cross-Sectional Survey. Now, I will say that osteopathy in Australia is in universities. So we would expect not to see that as a part of the conclusion from the gap. Abstract, I'm going to read. Osteopaths are an integral member of the healthcare team, playing a pivotal role in provision of care for patients with musculoskeletal disorders. Osteopaths, like other healthcare providers, are under increasing pressure to deliver evidence-based healthcare and to improve patient outcomes. However, the extent to which osteopaths engage in evidence-based practice, particularly in Australia, is not well understood. This study therefore set out to investigate the attitude, skills, and use of EBP and perceived barriers and enablers of EBP uptake among osteopaths practicing in Australia. Methods: National Cross-Sectional Survey of Australian Registered Osteopaths. Eligible participants were invited by email and other digital media recruitment strategies to complete the online evidence-based practice attitude and utilization survey, EBASE. So same, this is me pulling out of reading, same survey, just this time it's in English and it has not been translated. The results: total of 332 osteopaths completed the survey. Demographic characteristics of the respondents were generally consistent with characteristics of the Australian osteopathy workforce. Respondents were mostly favorable of EBP, with the majority agreeing or strongly agreeing that EBP assists in making decisions about patient care and improves the quality of patient care. While most respondents had some training in EBP, most reported a moderate level of perceived skill in EBP. The majority of respondents engaged infrequently, 0 to 5 times, in EBP activities within the last month, and most indicated that a very small proportion of their clinical practice was based on clinical research evidence. Leading barriers to the uptake of EBP were lack of time and lack of clinical evidence in osteopathy. Key enablers of EBP uptake were access to the internet and online databases at work, and access to full-text articles and EBP education materials. So again, same gap, same positive attitude towards it, same low amount of engagement, right? So they say they like it, but they don't do it. Conclusions: Osteopaths participating in the survey were largely supportive of evidence-based practice, yet engaged infrequently in EBP activities. An important next step in this research is to identify suitable strategies that effectively improve EBP uptake in osteopathy and perchance improve patient outcomes. So we see something stable in multiple countries and multiple contexts so far. Okay, so we'll go to another one. The next one, attitudes, skills, and use of evidence-based practice among UK osteopaths National Cross-Sectional Survey. This is from 2018. We have Leach, Thompson, Fryer, similar author group. Okay, we're going to read the abstract again. It's going to sound extremely familiar, even though we're going back in time. Evidence-based practice is a clinical decision-making framework that supports quality improvement in healthcare. While osteopaths are key providers of musculoskeletal healthcare, the extent to which osteopaths engage in EBP is unclear. Thus, the aim of this cross-sectional study was to investigate UK osteopaths' attitudes and skills and use of EBP and perceived barriers and facilitators of EBP uptake. Methods: UK registered osteopaths were invited to complete evidence-based attitude and utilization survey, eBase online, same survey. So to go back to reading, results of the 5,200 registered osteopaths in the UK, 9.9% responded to the invitation, 7.2% completed the eBase, which is less than 20% incomplete answers. The demographic characteristics of the survey sample were largely similar to those of the UK osteopathy workforce. The osteopaths reported overall positive attitudes towards EBP, with most agreeing that EBP improves the quality of patient care and is necessary for osteopathy practice. Osteopathy practice, please excuse how I read that. The majority reported moderate level skills in EBP, and most were interested in improving these skills. Participating osteopaths typically engaged in EBP activities 1 to 5 times over the last month. Barriers to EBP uptake included a lack of time and clinical evidence in osteopathy. Main facilitators of EBP included having access to online databases, internet at work, full-text articles, and EBP education materials. So same, to pull out of reading, same phenomenon, slightly different percentages. I'm not reading the percentages, but you get the picture. And same barriers, but also in the way that this is written, you can tell that some of the questions about facilitators and questions about barriers. So you don't need to see the survey to know what some of these questions are. One of the questions, the way that these questions are formed allow you to write this. The barriers, the questions about barriers is like, do you have time? Do you have clinical evidence? As far as facilitators, do you have online, like if you had online databases that you could access, if you had internet at work, if you had full text articles, if you had EBP education materials, would that make it easier? People, yes, 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 yes. Right. So you can sort of back engineer some of the questions from how this is reported, even though it's an abstract. To read the conclusions, so again, we have the gap. But to read the conclusions, UK osteopaths were generally supportive of evidence-based practice, had moderate level skills in EBP, and engaged in EBP activities infrequently. Development of effective interventions that improve osteopath skills and the incorporation of EBP into clinical practice should be the focus of future research. So you get the gap allowing for the conclusion to say we need more research, and then we need work to implement. All right. Which is not unreasonable. It's not a criticism, but you can see how this builds. So instead of simply sitting on our laurels and talking about osteopathy, because those surveys are based on the assumption that there is something positive about evidence-based medicine. So evidence-based medicine is considered a good thing, and it is considered something that should be applied to osteopathy because it's applied to other healthcare practices. So what the heck is evidence-based practice? And I'll do this. This is from StatPearls, which is essentially a free medical textbook that is hosted by the National Library of Medicine or the NIH, National Institute of Health. Right. So the fundamental definition, and so I'm going to read this. Evidence-based medicine uses a scientific method to organize and apply current data to improve healthcare decisions. Thus, the best available science is combined with the healthcare professional's clinical experience and the patient's values to arrive at the best medical decision for the patient. There are 5 main steps for applying EBM to clinical practice: defining a clinically relevant question, searching for the best evidence, critically appraising the evidence, applying the evidence, evaluating the performance of EBM. So, to pull out of reading, first, evidence-based medicine isn't a thing on its own. The fundamental construct is the scientific method to organize and apply current data to improve healthcare decisions. So you could remove all of the healthcare terminology. Evidence-based approach is using the scientific method to organize and apply current data to improve decisions. Okay, so fundamentally, how would you attempt to inculcate this? You wouldn't necessarily want to teach people specifically about evidence-based medicine first. First, you would want to teach the fundamentals. You would want to teach the philosophy of science because that is the bedrock upon which you would build everything. So any flaw, any issue with how the philosophy of science is applied within the realm of evidence-based medicine will then essentially propagate up all chains that are built on that. Right. So really, it's just the scientific method. So instead of getting really, really hot and bothered about evidence-based medicine or evidence-based practice, maybe you would be better served going to the scientific method, actually teaching the scientific method as an abstract skill or a framework, an abstract framework that is omnipresent regardless of the evidence that you're evaluating. So how do you teach an abstract framework that is omnipresent regardless of the information that you're evaluating? Well, you teach that with a FAR transfer paradigm. So once again, instead of critical thinking, you're talking about a FAR transfer paradigm. A FAR transfer paradigm is much more appropriate because it accurately describes how you will inculcate an abstract, omnipresent concept that is there regardless of the evidence or regardless of what you're doing. It's abstract, it's not tangible. If you teach with FAR transfer paradigm, you know that you must explicitly teach the abstract framework and you must provide a minimum of 2 examples to improve transfer. All right, as much as you can is better. But basically, you define a clinically relevant question. So if you can't formulate a question for the particular circumstance, you have a problem. So you have to teach people how to formulate questions. That's going to take a lot of time, right? How do you formulate a question? It's not necessarily how do you formulate clinical questions, it's how do you formulate a question. If you know how to formulate a question, then we can start to give you more examples of clinical questions. You'll get better at that. That is moving from novice to expertise. Searching for the best evidence. Well, at first, you're going to suck at searching for evidence. So again, it's moving from novice to expertise. Searching for evidence is an abstract, omnipresent framework. FAR transfer applies best. Critically appraising the evidence. There is going to be a constrained set of ways by which you can meaningfully critically appraise evidence. This is an abstract, omnipresent framework. FAR transfer, once again, applies the best. Applying the evidence. Applying the evidence, well, there's a novice to expertise. There's an omnipresent abstract framework. Realistically, it's probably a heuristic-based framework or the generation of possible solutions that are then applied to the situation at hand and tested between, right? Or differential diagnosis through treatment might be the abstract framework that you would want to apply, evaluating the performance. So that's looking at the outcomes. Then we get into the evidence, right? So this is going to help us understand what the heck is going on when all of these different countries and the osteopathic practitioners who replied said there isn't good levels of evidence. So if we look at the evidence levels that are put forth in the EBM framework, level 1A, evidence obtained from a meta-analysis of multiple well-conducted and well-designed randomized trials. Randomized trials provide some of the strongest clinical evidence, and if these are repeated and the results combined in a meta-analysis, then the overall results are assumed to be even stronger. So you have multiple data points pointing to the same thing over and over, regardless of population. There's the central tendency. I believe it's central tendency. Anyways, if you have random samples, a random sample might be far to the left or far to the right on whatever measurement scale that you're using, but you can assume that if you get enough random samples, it'll all move to the middle. But that the multiplicity of randomized trials that repeat the same result give you stronger confidence that it's a stable phenomenon regardless of random sample. Level 1B, evidence obtained from a single well-conducted, well-designed randomized control trial. A randomized control study, when well-designed and well-conducted, is gold standard for clinical medicine. The reason it's 1B is because it's not multiple. The confidence is not there as being repeated. Level 2A, evidence from at least one well-designed and executed non-randomized controlled study. When randomization does not occur, there may be more bias introduced to the study. Level 2B, evidence from at least one well-designed case control or cohort study. Not all clinical questions can be effectively or ethically studied with a randomized control study. So one of the things that is known to be challenging based on how most people within osteopathy conduct research is the idea of blinding or randomizing and controlling, right? So most circumstances, they'll try to apply a sham treatment, whereas one way that I would suggest that many studies in osteopathy could introduce a control is to have a non-treatment group. So you have a group that is treated with a codified method, and you have varying outcome measures. So you want to measure heart rate, respiration, and blood pressure. You do that. So you do that to start. You provide whatever standardized intervention you want to provide. You figure out the approximate time frame that takes, because the patient is likely to be in one position for a period of time, say 5 minutes. Then you reassess blood pressure, heart rate, and respiratory rate. Then what you would do is have a non-intervention control group. You would put them in the same position. So you would take their heart rate, blood pressure, and respiratory rate at the start. You would leave them in the same position as the treatment group for the same amount of time, say approximately 5 minutes, and then you would reassess heart rate, blood pressure, and respiratory rate at the end of the period of time. And then you would be able to compare intervention to no intervention. That would be your control group. So one of the reasons that osteopathy has challenges with control groups is they try to generate a sham control, and that includes touch, which means you can't control for the application of touch per se. So and all of the other factors. Whereas if you had a no treatment versus a treatment, and you had them in similar positions, you might be able to actually generate a control group that would allow you to evaluate outcomes, whatever your outcomes may be, right? So that's just a little bit of a riff there. Level 4, expert opinions from respected authorities on subject based on their clinical experience, right? So that's the lowest level of evidence. The thing that I would like to pull back to is that if you look at the evidence-based medicine definition, so it's simply the scientific method, right? There are highly constrained skills with the application of the scientific method. And one of the reasons for that is because if you don't do that, then really what you're introducing is the individual researcher. And this is where positivism serves as an important concept. So positivism would put forth that there is a singular reality that can be identified through appropriate experimentation. However, the researchers are always the challenge. That is why the randomized control studies are your gold standard, because they do a lot to remove the influence of the researcher, right? So the researcher is always going to influence it, but you want to remove them as much as possible. The reason that multiple repetitions with varying random samples increases your confidence with a randomized control trial. So multiple randomized control trials repeated over and over with different random samples is that it shows you that the phenomenon is stable, so that we're getting closer and closer to the singular reality that can be identified with appropriate experimentation. So if you don't do that, then what you're introducing is personal flair all the time. The thing to take from that is that if you teach the scientific method appropriately, then the scientific method has the opportunity to generalize to any profession or any data set. It doesn't mean that it always works perfectly well. It just means that you would predict that it would be better that way. If you go to the next step and you teach evidence-based practice in osteopathy, right, then any flaw in the evidence-based approach that exists in previous research that you're not able to detect will then be carried over and built vertically into anything that's done in evidence-based practice in osteopathy. So you don't benefit as much from teaching that part, or from teaching, say, the more restricted part first. You benefit more from teaching the more general, the more abstract concept first, which is the scientific method. and then building on top of that, so that you would want to teach that foundationally, then you would want to move over into evaluating evidence, the evidence base in osteopathy. The evidence base is known to have problems in osteopathy. I'm comfortable agreeing with that. So the studies, the surveys about the attitudes towards evidence-based practice and the use of evidence-based practice show a relatively similar thing, regardless of the location that they're applied or the random sample that they're applied. So you actually get something interesting. You see a similar set of phenomena regardless of location. You see people thinking it's great, but not using it. The conclusion drawn from that could easily be, let's teach EBP, evidence-based practice. However, the problem is noted that the evidence level is low. So osteopathy, from that, you can extrapolate that osteopathy may actually benefit more from people who are better at the scientific method than when compared to people who are well trained in evidence-based practice. Because osteopathy is suffering more from a lack of good evidence than it is suffering from a lack of evidence-based practice, on account of any evidence-based practice that would be performed would be based on poor evidence. So instead of saying we should teach EBP, we should say we should teach evidence generation or the scientific method and improve the quality of scientific research such that when we're ready to use better evidence, it's available. So EBP becomes more useful when there's better evidence available. The normal conclusion would be, yeah, let's just teach EBP better and more and whatever. But if you listened so far and you listened to the previous episode or the previous podcast that I've done talking about forget critical thinking, far transfer is a better paradigm. These are all constraint-driven processes. They're specific skill sets that are abstract skill sets that can apply in all circumstances, but they are highly constrained. They are quite narrow, so you want to teach those. And for a far transfer paradigm is better for that. So also, you're moving from novice to expertise, so you need multiple examples of it so that you can readjust how you're using these non-tangible abstract frameworks. So again, what this does is at least superficially supports my claim that we would be better off teaching absolute fundamentals, so something such as the philosophy of science and the scientific method, generating better evidence within the profession such that when we have that evidence-based practice would be more meaningful. So instead of going to step 3, we should probably consider step 1 before that. The thing that I would say is really positive about what's been done with these surveys. Also, I want to touch on the challenge with the surveys. So I will say that out loud so that I remember to do it. You see a stable phenomenon. The stable phenomenon is fantastic. That's really nice to see, because the phenomenon is stable regardless of random sample. The numbers are relatively similar regardless of random sample. The thing about surveys that might superficially, as a fundamental concept, explain why you see the difference between positive attitudes towards evidence-based practice and low use of evidence-based practice is there's a social desirability bias, or what you would call a social desirability bias, built into sample or survey respondents. Survey respondents will generally respond in a way that they perceive is less likely to get them kicked out of their social group or their perceived group. So they will say if they perceive, and they will also rather respond in ways that they believe is socially desirable for or in the eyes of the survey conductor. So they will say things that they think the survey conductor wants to hear. They will say things that they think the survey conductor wants to hear, or things that they think their social group or their perceived group wants to hear. So yeah, of course, evidence-based practice is fantastic. I think it's wonderful in a survey setting. And then did you do it? No, right? So you're seeing essentially the reported difference between attitude and activity. They may be engaging in evidence-based activities more than they report, but that could be the constraint of how the questions are written. Generating surveys is exceptionally difficult. But the really, really nice thing is that this has been conducted in multiple context and the phenomenon is stable. What I will say is that it allows me to build my argument in the gap that instead of trying to increase the teaching of evidence-based practice, I would say the profession would benefit better from fundamental teaching of the absolute bedrock of the philosophy of science, as well as of the scientific method, improve the evidence base so that then step two is actively use the evidence base. Now, the evidence base, with respect to a term called consilience or multiple lines of evidence pointing in the same direction, is probably not that bad. It's just maybe people, in the way that they evaluate the evidence, they can't quite get there. But multiple lines of evidence point in the general direction that osteopathy is a hands-on profession. It works from the external environment of observation. It is good at identifying, because it actively attempts to identify motion restrictions. It's good at that. Not necessarily specific locations of structures, but it's good at identifying motion restrictions. It can then change the motion restrictions, and then there's a general range of positive outcomes that come from that. However, the claims, this is where the evidence base is actually really strong or really reasonable with respect to consilience. The claims of, say, cranial or visceral or other things like the alteration of heart rate and blood pressure and things like that actually don't match up with the work. The work is good on movement, but it doesn't necessarily match up on the physiological marker as well as one would want. So we probably need to do a better investigation of how well we do at identifying movement restrictions, how well we do at changing movement restrictions. Then we'll have a solid, absolute groundwork, kind of bedrock foundation. Then we can see how often we are able to alter blood pressure, alter heart rate, and how much. Then we will be able to compare that to whether it's clinically relevant or how strong our intervention is when compared to, say, pharmaceutical interventions. We'll also be able to evaluate the conditions under which or what types of patients benefit most from an intervention for heart rate and respiration and blood pressure that is hands-on versus pharmaceutical. But you need the bedrock. You need to actually show that you consistently identify motion restrictions, you consistently change them. Then you can build on top of it. So the evidence-based practice surveys allow me to then abstract and go into, yeah, osteopathy just needs to be better at science. I've said that before, but this gives me an opportunity to walk you through how to build that argument, or how I do build that argument maybe a little bit more accurately. So if you've listened so far, thank you as always. Hopefully you learned something, and I'll talk to you again soon.